Check out this amazing illustration of the COVID vaccine. In an actual COVID infection, the virus enters the cell through its spike protein. This is how infections happen. Now, the vaccine is mRNA, which are the instructions to build the spike protein, inside a lipid layer that enters the cell and releases the mRNA. Ribosomes inside the cell attach to the mRNA and start building the spike protein. The spike protein itself is not harmful. Those spike proteins leave the cells and start circulating. Our immune system thinks this is a COVID infection and recognizes the spike protein and starts creating antibodies against the spike protein. If you are then exposed to the actual virus, our immune system remembers those spike proteins and antibodies attached to the virus, making it impossible to enter our cells and create an infection. Isn't science amazing?
Quick PSA for people who are HIV negative and out in the dating scene. People in the pos community or people who are living with HIV don't owe you explanations. In no circumstances is it our responsibility to make sure that you are comfortable with our existence, with our disease. That's not our job.
Yes, Daddy, deeper. Oh, deeper, deeper, deeper. Oh, yes, Daddy.
Hey, y'all sing it with me. The people in the back.
எதுவரை வாழ்க்கை அழைக்கிறதோ அதுவரை நாமும் சென்றிடுவோம். விடை பெறும் நேரம் வரும்போதும் சிரிப்பினில் நன்றி சொல்லிடுவோம். பரவசம் இந்த பரவசம்.
Oh, would you just look at me? I'm essential. Oh, would you just look at me? I'm essential. Oh, would you just look at me? Look at me. Look at me. Look at.
HIV does not have specific signs and symptoms because it is just a virus. But later it can transform into AIDS, which is acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And this is where you can...
Water, earth, fire, air. Long ago, the four nations lived together in harmony. Then, everything changed when the coronavirus attacked. Only the Avatar, master of all four elements, could stop them. But when the world needed him most, he vanished. 100 years passed and my brother and I discovered the new Avatar, an airbender named...
Stay inside, you dirty ass bitch.
You won't let go.
Bustin' a 40, spin on your shorty, don't do Bacardi. Bust up in yata, open your mata, shoot up the party.
Interior crocodile alligator. I drive a Chevrolet movie theater. Interior crocodile alligator.
Once upon a time, not long ago, I was a hoe. And I'm admitting it, I won't take it back. Cause I did this shit, I was a hoe.
HIV does not make people dangerous to know. So you can shake their hands and give them a hug. Heaven knows they need it.
It's Corona time. Hey, it's Corona time right now. It's Corona time.
I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush.
I don't wanna spit, I wanna go, I wanna gag, I wanna choke. I want you to touch that little dangly thing that's swinging the back of my throat. My head can miss.
Run.
Okay, I'm bored in the house and I'm in the house bored. Bored in the house and I'm in the house bored. Bored in the motherfucker in the house bored and I'm bored in the motherfucker in the house bored. Bored in the house, bored in the house bored. Bored in the house, bored in the house bored. I'm bored in the motherfucker in the house bored.
I've watched a lot of TikTok videos in the last year. Beats like Curtis Roach's Bored in the House have come to shake in my bones, giving cadence to my catatonic life, multiplying as other TikTokers sync with and replicate Curtis Roach's rhythm. He too doubles himself a year after going viral. His virality takes flight amidst the devastation, isolation, illness, and death of the COVID-19 pandemic. The infectious image, sound, and choreography is distributed by algorithm code and interface and offers me a rhythmic bomb amidst the havoc wreaked not only by an unpredictable novel coronavirus, but by the incredulous mismanagement of medical care by global governments. Today's Feminisms Unbound panel, Going Viral, features scholars who think with the unruly pathways of virality and viruses. Their critical writing on the virtual, art making, labor, algorithms, Ebola, HIV, and COVID-19 already offer us urgent tools to think of our present moment. Today, we're incredibly lucky to hear them together in concert, to listen for the harmonies and frictions as they offer us notes from the particular geopolitical and racial locations of their research. We're lucky to hear from Dr. Jifei Cheng, who thinks with the afterlives of Queer of Color AIDS archives, who historicizes the emergent language of viruses that simultaneously diagnosed digital and bodily ills in the 80s, who equips us with the tools to understand crises and as manufactured conditions of neoliberalism. We are fortunate to have with us Dr. Adia Benton, who deftly uplifts the tactics and theories of her HIV-positive interlocutors in Sierra Leone as they navigate global health structures and conditions of political violence, and who helps us as academics interrogate and mobilize the relevance of our research in times of emergency through forms of digital engagement. Joining us also is the very brilliant Dr. Shaka McLaughlin, who thinks with optimism and opacity about digital cultures and virtual worlds, mining language for possibility in terms like virtual, streaking, algorithm, and data, who enfleshes and enlivens bodies and corpses with sex and desire through a focus on the digital. And finally, one of my favorite people in the world, Dr. Gauri Vijaykumar, who refines the texture of living in the HIV/AIDS epidemic by grounding her work in rigorous and astute ethnography, who reterritorializes the scale of HIV studies by looking across the Indian Ocean at South-South exchange and funding and prevention practice, who teaches us to think pandemics as mundane and personal. Going Viral is the third in this year's Feminisms Unbound series that I co-curate with my very dear colleagues, Dr. Faith Smith at Brandeis and Dr. Elora Chowdhury at UMass Boston. This event would not be possible without the critical support of the Consortium for Studies in Gender, Women's Culture, and Sexualities Program Manager, Stacy Lance, and Administrative Assistant, Badri Al-Sabah. The consortium is a collaboration between 9 institutions in the Boston area: Boston College, Boston University, Brandeis, Harvard, MIT, Northeastern, Simmons, Tufts, and UMass Boston. We bring together feminist scholars and faculty from across our institutions and more through graduate level courses and public events like this each year. And you can find more information on how to teach for GCWS or to know about our events on the website. And GCWS is also very lively on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're grateful that you stuck with us through this year of virtual programming, and we hope you'll continue to participate as eagerly next year in whatever format this series takes. I'll be your moderator this evening. My name is Kareem Kupchandani. I'm an assistant professor in women's gender and sexuality studies and theater, dance, and performance studies at Tufts University. I live in Medford on land that once belonged to Wampanoag, Pawtucket, and Massachusetts tribes. A land acknowledgement can not only account for genocidal pasts, but the ongoing work of settler colonialism. And as we think today about viral empires, we can't forget that the introduction of diseases by European colonialists in the Americas were responsible for devastating indigenous populations. Moreover, Native Americans have seen mortality rates double that of white populations in the US due to COVID-19. The university I work at also sits on former slaveholding property, and it behooves me to acknowledge the legacy of anti-Black violence that has propped up our institutions and learning, that continues here in rapidly gentrifying Boston, and that repeatedly manifests in the extrajudicial killings of Black folks, which we once again witnessed last week in Minnesota when Daunte Wright was shot and killed by a police officer during a traffic stop. I appreciate that you are here amidst this national and global grief, a grief compounded by the loss of health and life to COVID-19, anti-Asian and Islamophobic violence, and increasingly securitized borders. A grief made profoundly unbearable for those whose lives and research straddle borders as we watch economic, military, and political conditions abroad worsen under the strain of the pandemic. A sadness that deepens each time we watch our sick parents over WhatsApp screens, unable to visit and care for them. We are exhausted, and many of us don't have a lot of feeling left to feel. As Dr. Vijay Kumar writes, somehow the incalculability of the pandemic has rendered most of us numb to its emotional life. And yet unexpected but infectious joys and hopes can sustain us, surprise us, and act as small promises for a better future. She continues, quarantine reminded me that when sociologists fetishize the next frontier of analysis, we may foreclose mundane suffering in real time, the inventiveness, the tactics of survival, even the joy of the scribbled drawing passed under the door. Even though I'm exhausted, I can say that today I'm very, very, very happy. Happy to be with friends, happy to be with these really fucking smart people who make scholarship that teaches me how to live with things I don't understand. We'll hear from them in the following order: Shaka, Adia, Gauri, and Jifei. They'll each speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, giving us a full hour for conversation between us and with you, the audience. I'll post their full bio in the chat before they each, when they each start speaking. And if you want to see closed captioning, please hit the closed captioning button at the bottom of the Zoom. And I should have said that before this. I'm sorry I didn't. We'll also share a link where you can see the transcript as it's being created and adjust the font size and color. Feel free to write questions in the question and answer box that I'll get to at the end of the talks, as well as drop comments and compliments in the chat. Make sure when you're using the chat that you send your messages to all panelists and attendees. So this is a webinar, we can't see you, so get into your pajamas, pour yourself a drink, put your dinner in the oven, and give a round of applause for Dr. Shaka McGlutton.
Hey all, Kareem, thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this, and I'm really looking forward to what all the other panelists are going to be up to. So I'm about to do something new. It's like the first time I've done it. So yeah, more fragility, more experimentation. Let's see how this goes. So oops, I want to make that screen. So. What I like the best about being a media studies scholar and technology studies scholar is that I always show up at things and forget how to use them, like right away, immediately. All right, so what do I know about virality? I ain't never made nothing viral. 8 years after my academic book, Virtual Intimacies, came out, it's been cited 182 times. That's not even academic viral. I practiced my selfies but got lazy. So my selfies are good, but how many do I need to post to be popular? When my partner and I first got together, he talked about starting an OnlyFans. He still could because he's so fine. He has years worth of content, and I mean years. As part of a fellowship, I was asked to join a research group, or I was assigned, it's hard to tell these days, called Labor Futures. The lead is a proper labor organizer from the West Coast and is now starting to dig into digital labor or forms of labor tied to big data, which is to say all labor, all data, all the time. At the meetings, I say, I don't really know why I'm here or what I'm supposed to be doing. The only things I think to offer are these very underdeveloped thoughts about sex work and how Ms. Rona has complicated the lives of digital sex workers. I have done, I should say, actually zero research on this, but I have friends who do it, and they actually do it, I mean. So when I'm asked to talk about this on a podcast organized by the fellowship program, I don't really feel like I can say no. I tell them again that I'm not really sure I know anything helpful about labor, that I labor, and that it's not really my thing to labor or to study it as such. They pair me with a farm worker activist with some Luddite tendencies. And we talk on our own in preparation for this podcast. And then weirdly or not, we have all these amazing things in common. And after he tells me about the ways that migrant farm workers are treated just like Amazon warehouse workers, probably worse, where every movement, every moment tracked, fingerprints collected, DNA samples, at every corner, the farm is trying to ensure that these workers are not stealing time, stealing their labor back. After that, I sent him this link to this 2008 Alex Rivera film called Sleep Dealer, in which Mexican would-be migrants use their bodies, their life energies to remote control robots on the other side of the border. So I bone up, I read a bunch of stuff for this podcast. I read a lot of Wikipedia, really. I didn't even know about the whole Bella porn thing, Bella porn. And, it gets pretty simple. My so-called findings, I shouldn't even say that these are my findings. This is like what I prepared to labor toward a thing that I don't really know anything about, that other people really do. But I'll tell you what I think, if we're having so my hunch here is just that porn performers these days, have always been shooting for studios. They've been escorting. So escorting is out, even if it wasn't. In these sort of digital sex ecologies, porn shoots pave the way for solo porn production, amateur and not so amateur. There's a whole kind of national, even international network of performers who go around the world and perform with one another. All of this appears, of course, in up to 2-minute and 20-second clips on Twitter, just like clips from the studio work. Twitter accounts point to their OnlyFans, or their Just for Fans, or their Gay for Fans, or whatever. There you might subscribe to an account to see the content, but even there are layers of content. You might subscribe and then still need to pay to unlock material. Recently, I unlocked additional content for the first time, and guess what? That $12 didn't pay for anything. I couldn't find better for free. I asked the supervisor at the fellowship if I can submit the OnlyFans receipts for reimbursement, and she says yes. I decide again and again, it's unrelated to the sex or not, to make some TikToks. I find them excruciatingly hard to make. So, people really make them look easier than they are. Over the summer, I fall down the TikTok rabbit hole like Lil Nas X falls down that hole, except that he has more self-control. That's one of my appetite management ditties, mantras. Lil Nas X falls down that pole, except that he has more self-control. Maybe you should share some of yours.
Yeah.
What goes viral during the pandemic are my appetites. Shamed after leaving the one Black Lives Matter protest I attended, so fearful of being cuddled on the Brooklyn Bridge, I mostly spent weeks on the couch playing Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and smoking weed and drinking. I don't really feel unbound at all. Not when addiction is a bind, not when addiction's a bitch. So virality, that fucking video that I refused to watch, or that other one, it's been months off Democracy Now! I just want Amy Goodman to comb her damn hair and stop showing them. You know, my beloved white passing partner comes home who, although he's half Puerto Rican, suddenly, I think only now this past summer really got woke-ish, whatever that means. He comes home and he wants to talk about how he almost cried again listening to Democracy Now! And I just can't. Inside, I am incandescent. I want to say sorry to my loss's loss. Bye-bye, Rona. Yeah.
Listen, you gotta stop giving your attention to someone who doesn't see your work. You're the baddest bitch. Yeah. You deserve the world, and if they don't see that, it's time to pick yourself up, move on, and tell them, I'm so sorry for your loss. If he don't love you anymore, it's their loss. Just walk your fine ass out the door. Look at that bitch. Yes. I do my hair, talk, check my nails. Baby, how you feeling? Really doing it, man.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shaka. That was good as hell. Thank you so much. Clearly, I now understand the comment you left on my Instagram about the TikTok you wanted to create, and TikTok is a lot of work. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Adia Benton. And feel free to please use the chat, talk to us, leave compliments and magic and emojis. We welcome them. Over to you.
Well, you see, I had my good as hell response. You know, every time I hear that song, I wonder why I'm not feeling as good as hell. But so this, I had a lot of thoughts about virality, and I've been struggling with some things. So I'll just talk about things and see what happens. What I want to start with is the story of survivorship. It's something that's a part of the book that I'm trying to finish up about Ebola in West Africa during 2014 and from 2014 to 2016. I would usually show a slide here, and that slide would be of an event that happened in September 2016 in Boston at Harvard Medical School in one of their amphitheaters. It was sponsored by the Broad Institute and the government of Sierra Leone, and the event was called something like a story about survivors and a story about those who didn't survive. And it was one of those things where, you know, you go in and it's just a bunch, 200 medical students, doctors, and others who are interested in hearing the stories of survival. The people who are a part of the panel are a member of the a person from the Sierra Leone embassy, a survivor named Yusuf Kaba from Freetown, Paul Farmer, the physician anthropologist, and Pardis Sabeti, a genomic scientist based at the Broad Institute. And as Yusuf is telling before Yusuf tells his story, there's a picture of 4 Ebola survivors holding in front of them their discharge certificates. And those are certificates that are awarded to them as they leave the Ebola treatment center. And it's a way of certifying their belonging to a new class of what I would say viral subjects. Obviously, people know, or some of you probably know that my first book, HIV Exceptionalism, focused on support associations and the ways in which it became a means for people, especially poor Sierra Leoneans or poor Freetonians, to become and showcase their positivity. But it was also an opportunity for the government to perform its good governance through these particular civil society organizations. And so as I was watching Yusuf's presentation, I was I think I was dismayed, because I thought it was a cynical read on what it is that survivorship meant. The slide that he showed, and the one that I actually have multiple pictures of, and I show it and I'm not even sure what I'm trying to say, it has like a kind of this PowerPoint template diagram, which has like all these charts and graphs that represent or present the findings of a survey, these pillars of intervention. And it made me think, well, you're basically, survivorship is now a sort of expansive or extensive category. And in some ways, I think it becomes another instance of virality, which is to say the organizations make more of themselves. So I kind of wanted to touch on what it is that survivorship is about and what it becomes. And I think the reason I'm interested in talking about this now, in addition to the fact that I'm trying to kind of finish this chapter in the book, is we're talking about long COVID, or the after effects of COVID, or what kinds of narratives emerge that don't conform to what we have known as outbreak narratives, or the narrative arc that looks like the epidemic curve that we were trying to flatten about a year ago. And so what does it mean when your story or a series of individual stories do not map onto a narrative arc that is, the presentation of a problem rising towards conflict and resolution, which is to say the curve that you were trying to flatten in March was also that curve that represents the stories. So what is survivorship under the circumstances that I happen to be thinking about with Ebola? So survivorship, when you have your discharge papers in front of you, and it becomes a kind of a pass, actually. So actually, I should probably say, what is an Ebola survivor? An Ebola survivor is a person who tested positive for Ebola, went into a treatment center, and upon receiving treatment and living after 2 weeks or something, they have a negative test and they leave this treatment center. So that discharge, there's a ritual of leaving. And in fact, when I say that, I'm not joking. It is you. You leave your old clothes. You go through a sort of shower, a disinfecting shower. You walk and that's in the red zone, and then you go through the green zone. People dance, sing, and clap for you, and you put your hand in some paint and you leave a handprint on the wall. Many people pose with their discharge papers for a photograph. And the discharge paper or certificate has been a thing that people may use to access services or whatever. And in the aftermath, so a couple, 3-4 years down the road, many of those services ceased to exist. A few of them continue to exist, but they exist in I'd say a kind of emaciated health system, in the sense that you may have free healthcare as a result of your survival, or as a condition of your survivorship. But if you live in a rural area that isn't well stocked or well staffed, then your free healthcare, your membership has poses problems, or at least limits the extent to which you can fully embrace the fruits of membership. So survivorship then, in the way that I'm trying to think about it, is a bureaucratic and administrative category, in the sense that it helps distributive logics, or it undergirds, or survivorship produces certain kinds of distributive logics, but also rest upon existing ones. But it does not include the people who are kin, the people who are who are biological kin or other kin, household members. So again, if you're able to access free care, if you're fortunate enough to be able to do so, the people in your household are not. It's a biological category, and one that I think is extractive and exploitative. So people who were discharged were also seen as immune. So they were people who could be employed or asked to volunteer in health facilities. They were asked to go on contact tracing trips into certain neighborhoods to build trust and to serve as intermediaries. The survivors that I talked to were also, and this is one of those bizarre gendered, the ways that sort of gender categories emerge from virus and virality. One of the projects that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention continued beyond the outbreak was one in which they collected bodily fluids from people. And actually, I think they only really took out or requested semen. So a member of the Survivors Association was riding his motorbike all over Sierra Leone to get men to ejaculate. That's a story I'm happy to delve into later. But there's also this political category. So as cynical as I was about this presentation that made Ebola survivorship look like HIV membership, what I discovered was that people were also trying to, so survivors were, in light of this sort of emaciated health system that they were struggling against, began to think about how to fully enlarge the scope of healthcare and public health and health provision. So they became experts, people who wanted to be engaged deeply with research. They wanted to challenge government ideas about healthcare as a human right. So actually provisioning and providing care at the most remote levels. They joined a lawsuit against the government of Sierra Leone about, with respect to how resources were distributed during the Ebola outbreak. And so to some extent, survivorship also was a leverage point to redistribute resources. So beyond, and I think finally there's this phenomenological or social category of the survivor. When can survivorship be deployed as a form of citizenship, as a form of solidarity, as a form of immunity, as in relation to a series of political, social, and biological relationships. So I'll stop there, and thank you for the opportunity to have this, what I'm sure is going to be a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benton. I want you to know I got a good chuckle out of both the motorbike ejaculations, but also Shaka's complimentary emojis to go with it. Next, we have Dr. Gauri Vijaykumar.
Okay. Okay. Can you all see that? Is that working?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for organizing this. So I'm gonna kind of try to take this opportunity to help myself think about some questions that are central to my book, and I'll try to kind of circle back at the end to how I think it might relate to the present moment. So one of the questions that my book essentially asks is, how do states and medical experts understand viral contagion through existing geographic imaginaries? And how are those imaginaries underpinned by sexuality? So AIDS might seem like the kind of exceptional or ideal case for understanding this, especially the sexual imaginaries, but I hope you'll be able to see how this is actually relevant beyond AIDS. So from the very beginning, the question of whether AIDS was really a crisis for India was contested. So in 1994, the director of the newly formed National AIDS Control Organization described what he called a really alarming rise in HIV. And he wrote, the trends in Bombay, in fact, are quite comparable to the trends earlier observed in some of the African states. The trends are so similar as to forewarn us about the impending epidemic of HIV involving the general population, as has happened in these African countries. Now, this was a debated conclusion. So on the other hand, a 1995 editorial in the same journal worried that AIDS might just be a prelude to test the so-called AIDS vaccine on the poor Asian people. And the author concluded that AIDS was in fact being disseminated from the developed countries, notorious for their permissive society. So you can already kind of see here a hint of the tensions and debates facing the post-colonial nation state in the face of AIDS. On the one hand, the specter of Africa, on the other hand, the subjugation of a sexually permissive West. So let me back up for a minute and try to connect this to virality. So when I first started working on this project, and I'll say I'm not a medical sociologist or anthropologist, but I had noticed how social and political theorists would use the metaphor of the virus to describe the dynamics of capitalism. So here's one passage from two critical geographers, Jamie Peck and Adam Tickell, writing about the dynamics of neoliberalism. And they say viruses are dangerous because they spread and bodies politic, while they may exhibit differing degrees of resistance, are rarely immune to all the strains. So today we hear that capitalism is the virus or racism is the virus. And usually when people use virality in this way, they mean two things, right? Viruses spread quickly and that they're deadly, right? But I am actually, and this is something I don't usually talk about, a medical school dropout. So because of that, I have some half-baked and incomplete knowledge about how viruses work. And I think that actually this is one of those places where that knowledge can be useful. So one of the things about viruses that I learned in my brief time in medical school is that they are not actually alive, right? They actually operate by repurposing the organism that is their host. So the virus destroys you because it is using the infrastructure of your cells. And this is why the experience of infection for a lot of people who experience it is not of being attacked from outside, but of your own body becoming kind of unrecognizable to you. Viruses also mutate, right? So they bear the imprint of the places they've been, and we can see this in discussions of the South African variant or the UK variant of COVID-19. So I actually think this is a good metaphor for neoliberal capitalism, and actually better than the kind of spreading quickly metaphor. But it also operates well as a metaphor for how discourses of disease operate, and that's what kind of I'm trying to figure out in my book. So I'm particularly interested in how they adapt in relation to imaginaries of the nation and the nation as racialized and sexualized. So now I'll come back to India in the 1990s. So what you could already see from the examples I started off with was how the specter of AIDS was animated by symbolic geography. So one reference point was kind of the foreign or the West. And there was this binary between Western sexual degeneracy and material excess and India's moral virtue. So here's just some posters from the time. And you can also see this kind of monogamous heterosexual home against the dangers of foreign sex. And part of this was also homosexuality as a Western indulgence. So this is an example of an Indian expert who told the press that the homosexuality percentage in India was 5 to 15% homosexuals compared to 40 to 60% in the US. So a lot of scholars have written about these binaries of Western and Indian sexuality, but there's been less written about the idea of Africa in these discourses. So what I will try to do next is kind of unpack a little bit of how the binaries of Indian purity and Western degeneracy went along with racialized discourses of Indian modernity and African crisis. So if you look at the medical literature on AIDS in India in the 1980s and especially the 1990s, a lot of the discussion is about whether the epidemic in India looks similar to Africa or not. And ultimately, this question kind of settles around the conclusion that India has a heterosexual epidemic and the West has a homosexual epidemic. And the idea of Africa is actually key to this, right? So the conclusion is that India is more like Africa than the West. And in my book, I actually explore how it was often the same researchers who were going from Canada, the US, to Nairobi, to Bangalore, to Northern Karnataka, to Bombay, to kind of to do these studies to confirm this intuition. So this expertise also had concrete effects on state repression for two groups in particular, right? So for sex workers and for Africans. So more euphemistically, a pool of infected women and foreign students who were assumed to be African. So for example, in Tamil Nadu, medical authorities detained some 800 sex workers for mandatory testing and confinement, and they were left with limited food, access to medical care, cut off from their families. There were women who died in confinement. And also after an African student was found to be HIV positive, the Indian Ministry of Health announced that AIDS testing was compulsory for all foreign students. By 1987, 11 African students had been deported, and actually some African students associations protested these guidelines. So there was a march in Delhi in 1987, and the protesters argued that this was a case of medical apartheid. This repression also happened famously with Dominic D'Souza, who was a gay man, but state HIV policy tended to erase gay men and their relationship to AIDS and focus on these other groups. So I just want to point out that these incidents reflected both a spatial and a temporal cartography. So as Siddharth Dubey wrote, Africa's present HIV/AIDS caused hell is very probably India's future. And in my book, I talk about how statistical modeling and citational practice and transnational research partnerships actually reinforced what Manjri Mahajan calls foreknowledge of India's AIDS trajectory. By the time I was doing fieldwork, which was almost 20 years later, this narrative had been replaced by a narrative of India's success in contrast to Africa's failure. So this is an article from 2015 about how India can look back with some success at its programs. And I studied how Indian experts actually went to Kenya and Nigeria to share their expertise on HIV prevention. But again, I just want to emphasize the animating role of sexuality here. So the post-colonial nation had managed to distinguish itself from Western sexual permissiveness, but also unchecked African sexuality. And it was within this geography that queer death was erased. So while cisgender women in sex work were violently surveilled, queer death was largely erased. And this is actually kind of an interesting obverse to the gentrification of memories of AIDS activism in the US in the shadows of kind of a white elite imagined cis male gay epidemic, right? But actually these erasures, I argue in the book, were produced in relation to each other within the global field of public health expertise. And this is actually despite the fact that throughout this time, there were many examples of AIDS activism and solidarity between gay and lesbian activists and sex worker activists in India. So I know I'm talking too much, so I'll just move quickly to some thoughts about now. So today, as India's new role on the world stage is consolidated, we see how COVID management and drug production are tied to India's claim to a new global position. So this is Narendra Modi's effort to be a friend to Africa. And the so-called Modi Doctrine includes an anticipated $150 billion in bilateral trade with African countries by 2023. And health diplomacy is a centerpiece of that policy. But even as COVID becomes an opportunity for the Indian state to flex its muscles as an emergent power, the morality politics it elicits echo the legacies of AIDS panic. So let me give you one example. So in the summer of 2020, researchers at Harvard and Yale medical schools published a study arguing that red light districts were a key source of disease, and they have recommended closing red light districts. Sex worker activists reported that this report actually resulted in police harassing sex workers, demanding bigger bribes, and referencing this finding because it was circulating in English and vernacular language news. So VAMP is a collective of sex workers that's based in Sangli, Maharashtra. And I just kind of wanted to end with their response to that study. So they got together and discussed the study and wrote this article, which was published in multiple languages and also published on Medium. And this article is a series of proposals for research, right? So they actually tell the researchers at Harvard and Yale that they want to have a research partnership with them. And they suggest a series of studies, right? So they proposed an obesity audit of Cambridge, and a study of the sewers of Connecticut. And they essentially say, if you're going to research us, we can also research you. So I just want to end here because I think it's a small example of how sex workers upended the racial and sexual geographies of medical expertise and imaginaries of viruses. So I'll stop there. Oh, let me stop the share. Okay, thank you.
Wow, Gauri, thank you so much. The sort of efficacy which you moved us across national borders in comparative and intimate modes was really beautiful. I'm very, very excited to hear next from Dr. Jifei Cheng.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to my co-presenters. I'm really thinking a lot with what they've just said. I'm going to share my screen. Oops. Okay, share screen. All right. Can folks see the presentation squarely?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm Jaffe. I'm currently located in the unceded territory and traditional homelands of the Tongva peoples, or what is also referred to as Greater Los Angeles, California. A heaping thanks to the event organizers, staff, students, and faculty of GCAWS and Feminisms Unbound, in particular. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm losing my notes. What am I doing? Back up. Okay. I'm excited for our conversation. Sorry, let me back up a few here. I jumped a little bit. Especially to Professor Karim Kubchandani, who I greatly admire, whom so warmly extended my invitation to speak. I'm excited for our conversations today with you all, with the panelists in the audience, and I have a lot to learn. In this moment, I want to observe the passing of Dante Wright, who was murdered by police on April 11th in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, just miles from Minneapolis, where Derek Chauvin is on trial for murdering George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. As well, the murder of Dominique Luscious, who is the 14th trans or non-binary person and the 9th Black trans feminine person killed in the US since the start of 2021. On March 16th, 8 people were murdered across the 3 Atlanta spas, including 7 women, 6 of whom are of East Asian descent. They are Park Soon Chung, Kim Hyung Jung, Kim Soon Cha, Yue Yong-ae, Tan Xiaojie, and Feng Daoyou. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who is of New Mexico's Laguna Pueblo, was establishing initiatives to halt the epidemic of missing and murdered Native women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples. On April 10th, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, Dakota and Lakota historian, genealogist, and Standing Rock Sioux tribal citizen and the founder of the first camp for the Native women-led protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline, passed with brain cancer. Just some of the events that we're currently immersed in. I want to observe the overwhelmingly Native, Black, and Latinx lives in the settler colonial US and those minoritized subjects across the global South that have been lost to COVID-19 as their communities, our communities, continue to endure the ensuing years without an effective vaccine. The lives of these individuals and of the people I've worked with and lost in the ongoing HIV/AIDS global pandemic lead my analysis today. I present to you research that bridges 2 book-length projects. The first, titled Materialist Virology, historicizes HIV/AIDS in relation to the colonial history of virology, beginning with the late 19th century scientific discovery, quote unquote, of viral existence in tobacco plantation agriculture. The second project, tentatively titled Queer Across the Straits, STRAITS, historicizes how the fields of virology and genetics have simultaneously structured whiteness and Chineseness in historical memory and contemporary geopolitics. It begins with an investigation into the 1990s HIV epidemic outbreak in my paternal grandfather's province of Henan, in what is now the People's Republic of China. A brief version of what I present today will appear as a short article in the issue coming out next month of Radical History Review. Co-editors Emily K. Hobson and Dan Royals have collected various essays entitled the issue, quote, "The AIDS Crisis is Not Over." There are 3 points that I want to make today. One, that we need a comparative approach to viral pandemics. Here I focus on HIV/AIDS and SARS-CoV-2/COVID-19, simultaneous with the comparative studies of race and ethnicity across national boundaries. While their modes of transmission and prevention may be different, I demonstrate in my first book project that our research, public health, state, and commercial responses to each and every pandemic build and echo one another. There is a cycle of viral pandemics which implicates our biomedical attempts to address them as fundamentally part of the problem. The virus is a form. Around 2007, British multimedia artist Luke Jerram began working with virologists and glass blowers to scale micrograph images of viruses so that they are at least hand-sized for art gallery exhibition and sale, or even larger than humans for public display in commercial centers. These glass viruses invert the logic of scientific observation. They reveal how our perception of viral existence depends on the technologies of light refraction cast through glass surfaces, including photography, cinema, digital enhancement, and microscopes. In short, the form of a virus is an image. Our thinking about viruses rely on our persistent address of them as discrete visual objects for knowledge production. The emphasis on their isolated form as visual objects removes, or more precisely extracts, viruses from their ecological contexts. Although the field of virology is vast, from plant virology to viral archaeology, we tend to focus on the narrow intellectual bandwidth which directs virology's application to biomedicine. This isn't simply a problem for scientists, it is also a pervasive approach in the humanities, which I am claiming as part of my work. The extractivist approach colors viruses as malicious and targets them for biomedical elimination, including the use of pills and vaccines to prevent their replication, while ignoring how viruses are crucial to spurring genetic mutation and maintaining ecosystem diversity and survival. This is an approach that ultimately benefits humans, and by human, I mean the largely white, property-owning, cisgendered, able-bodied, heterosexual subjects of the nuclear family. Viruses remain a problem for mass production because of their propensity toward genetic mutation, counters processes of mass production and consumption, or what we might call monoculturalism. We must ask why certain communities, namely racialized, minoritized, working class, and poor communities, are more susceptible to viral infection and illness and death. True, our biomedical industries led by the US and its biotech firms systematically deny access to those without capital. We see this with COVID-19 vaccines. However, this analysis focuses on making corrective adjustments to biomedical interventions. It presumes that fixing or even overhauling the biomedical industry will prevent novel viruses. The ecological degradation, extractivism, and modes of mass production and consumptions committed by humans will continue to make paths for the zoonotic leap of viruses. This includes our preventative measures such as condoms, personal protective equipment, antiretrovirals, pre and post-exposure prophylaxis pills, and vaccines, which are all designed for single use and whose material form and toxic impacts will last longer than the lifespan of any living creature. This leads me to my second point. Am I on the right slide? This leads me to my second point. Studies of viral pandemics tend to focus epidemiologically on finding the mythical patient zero. The supposed origin for novel viral transmission promises to reveal how previously untapped reservoirs, specifically wild animal populations like simians or bats, facilitated the infection of livestock and eventually or directly humans. Next, we attempt to administer control over these animal and human populations, once again, biomedically, while ignoring the conditions of mass extraction. Instead of committing to biomedical, maybe I have slides out of order, sorry about that. Instead of recommitting to biomedical extraction, I focus on a principle of the cycle of capitalist production and consumption, that is surplus, the amount accrued or produced over and above what is required to survive in order to generate profit. I argue that surpluses, both labor and production surpluses, create viral reservoirs. My object of study in today's instance is cold blood, that is a transnational biomedical industry centered around the 20th century private enterprise in global blood banking and distribution. My archive entails the scientific and news reports on viral transmissions, an approach that's commonly used, but which I really worked through and developed while working in HIV/AIDS, social services, which overlap with my years in graduate research. In particular, I analyze how the science and media reporting on how HIV transmissions have occurred through the global expansion of the commercial routes for blood plasma that was coercively extracted from poor communities, processed and refrigerated for storage, and then dispensed for global use as biotechnological projects. This brings me to my final point, modern blood banking derived from finance and war. Sorry for the slides being out of order. Established in 1863, the Red Cross manifested its founder, Swiss banker Henry Dunant's vision to make war, quote unquote, humanitarian. This led to the 1864 Geneva Conventions, the international laws governing war and our definitions of human rights. In 1941, the American Red Cross initiated a blood plasma donation program to serve US Armed Forces. By 1948, the ARC began blood collection for civilians. The US rose to prominence as the world's dominant supplier of blood plasma during the 1970s. In 2004, the US collected about almost 70% of the world's plasma, with 40% eventually used in North America, 32% in Europe, and 19% in Asia. The first blood bank mobilized for use in modern China was in 1943. So it was organized by the American Bureau for Medical Aid to China, a New York-based aid organization formed in 1937 by sympathetic white and Chinese Americans to support medical relief in China. The blood was sourced from 1,157 donors, including Black, white, Chinese, in South Asian and Japanese descent peoples in the US, and transported to what was then Republic of China, led by President and Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek of the Kuomintang, or nationalist military and government. This supported China's modern militarization efforts and aided World War II era US-China alliance forged under the 1943 Sino-American Treaty for the relinquishment of extraterritorial rights in China. Stated otherwise, blood banking was introduced to modern China via the US alongside Air Force training and armament for the purposes of World War II global military buildup. After the war, laboratory medicine or biomedicine or Western medicine replaced other forms of treatment and care. Biomedicine universalized the normal body at odds with the pathological environment. The Cold War between the Eastern Bloc communist states and the Western Bloc capitalist states perpetuated anxiety over global security and nuclear annihilation. US-led imperial wars over nuclear energy, natural resources, and geopolitical power continued to result in traumatic injury and disease, thus requiring a surplus of blood for biotechnological development and biomedical use. Blood collection became marketed as humanitarian while being simultaneously used to invest in and subsidize war and medicine. From its late 19th century beginning in medical emergency usage during armed conflict to a largely privatized network of blood banks by the 20th century, the maintenance of blood plasma surplus has come to underwrite the global biomedical industry, as well as biotechnological research, national security, global wars, and the Cold War itself. Since modern China's initial foray into blood banking during World War II, however, blood collection has been met with uneven success. Under the nationalist government, hungry and poor students and laborers were motivated as much by the offer of eggs and soy milk as by a sense of altruism and nationalism to support the war against Japanese occupation. After the war, followed by the recommenced Chinese Civil War and the 1949 defeat of the nationalist government by the Chinese Communist Party, the exiled nationalist government took with them their blood banking technology and infrastructure. As medical historian Wayne Su contends, the CCP government banned the commodification of blood, arguing that a socialist ideal of donating blood must reject the pernicious market-based approaches of their previous regime, which brought its practices to Taiwan. Notably, Sun observes, Taiwan has since developed one of the most extensive outreach programs for blood donations anywhere in the world. Furthermore, Sun suggests that illicit buying and selling of blood continued in China for a decade after the communist victory in 1949. The biotechnologization of blood has only become possible because of the advent of cold storage. So I won't go into all of this and for the sake of time. Cold blood is a material and ideological state of biotechnological surplus. The slowed and suspended states of cold chain circulation also archive the visceral and historically violent processes of mass blood collection and remain hidden behind a scientific narrative of extraction made palatable for biotechnological consumption. Blood banking coincided with US transition from chattel slavery to its institutional legacy in the modern prison system. Prisons consolidated newly freed yet persistently disenfranchised Black populations through Jim Crow laws. The US pharmaceutical industry gained its wealth and global dominance through eugenic research and plasmapheresis conducted by Dr. Austin R. Stowe on prisoners largely throughout the US South from 1937 to 69. Despite having no formal training or education in pharmacology, Stowe managed to conduct between 25% and 50% of the initial drug tests in the US. He extracted, experimented on, and sold massive amounts of prisoners' blood, which advanced the development of blood biotechnologies and US pharmaceutical industry. Stowe bypassed all regulations and lacked medical licensing for blood transportation, yet still he used plasmapheresis on incarcerated people to yield 193,970 cubic centimeters of hyperimmune gamma globulin solution per month. This rate of extraction amounted to about 1/4 of the US national supply. Stowe helped the US become the world's largest purveyor of blood, and his process involved a high level of contamination in technicians' hands and surfaces of tables, equipment in actual bags and tubing in the procedure, leading to loss of life and massive HIV and Hep C transmission. The US penal system continued to extract the blood of incarcerated people through 1984, especially in Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Missouri, and Nevada. The Arkansas Department of Corrections persisted in doing this until 94. In 99, a group of Canadian hemophiliacs living with HIV and Hep C filed suit against Arkansas and Louisiana Departments of Correction, claiming that they had been infected through contaminated blood during the 80s and onward. And some of these the pharmaceutical corporations they were suing were the very ones that Austin R. Stowe was supplying. In late May 85, how am I doing on time? I just want to double check.
We can go for about 4 more minutes.
Okay, I'm going to speed through this. In May 19, I'll just talk through this really fast. In late 1985, Argentinian descent and California resident Oscar Messina and his arrived in the People's Republic of China as the first mass wave of visitors in the post-Mao era of market liberalization, or what China now calls a socialist market economy. So the PRC decided to loosen its tourism policy in 85, but what it also opened itself onto was new ideologies, but also market exchanges beyond its control. Messina, while traveling, became severely sick and ended up being hospitalized and passed from lung infection and respiratory failure in Beijing. It took until late 85 for the PRC to announce that Messina was the first recorded case of HIV/AIDS in the country, and also its first HIV/AIDS related death. So according to the China Public Health Ministry, Messina's family said that Messina was diagnosed with AIDS prior to his arrival. But what the PRC subsequently did was it banned all blood products because it also then found that its imported blood products from the US from 83 to 85 had caused at least 4 HIV transmission cases in the People's Republic of China amongst its patients. It also started to ban its foreigners who test positive for HIV, and it closed all its doors to HIV positive people. And Beijing believed that homosexuality and casual sex were illegal and contrary to Chinese morality, thus providing a false sense of protection from HIV's epidemic spread. In 89, there was an outbreak amongst heroin injection drug users and an ethnic, also known as an indigenous minority called the Nosu. In 96, gynecologist Gao Yaojie noticed that her patient had become infected with HIV, and she uncovered a massive case of HIV epidemic amongst the people in my paternal grandfather's province of Henan, largely farmers who once were rural farmers who had been given plots of land and survived on farming, but with the new market transformations in China, they no longer could make money off of farming and started donating their blood in order to be able to survive because they were incentivized to do so. But like in the case of Dr. Austin R. Stowe, these measures were both illegal and unsanitary, causing massive HIV transmission. I won't go through this slide, but just some translations how blood banking isn't just a metaphor in US language, because its translations into the Sinitic language, or what people call Chinese language, reveal that it literally is chained to ideas around finance and the market. I won't go through too much more, but what I also investigate is the history of blood laws that on which Chinese citizenship becomes based by 1909. So before then, there was no such thing as Chinese citizenship. There were definitely Chinese subjects under the Qing Empire, but the idea of a modern liberal citizenship was introduced in 1909, and it was according to blood laws, which then transformed its citizenship to be able to, for the state to be able to identify its citizens and then distribute property. So regardless of whether it's the Republic of China or the People's Republic of China under communist rule, the idea of citizenship and property ownership have solidified. And with the reentry of China into the global market economy, and the development and the deindustrialization of the US and the industrialization of China, you see factories crop up across China, and people begin to not be able to farm for a living, and instead migrating to parts of China where they, big cities where they don't own property and can't own property. So therefore they start to not only work in factories, they also start to sell their blood and engage in sex work in order to get enough money to subsist on, whereas those subsistence those forms of subsistence were met by the state under socialism. So I'll end there just for the sake of time, but the point I want to make is that blood actually undergirds our modern biomedical industry. It is not just a metaphor, it is actually the foundation for the way we think about money, that finances both war and medicine. And it is also the supply routes for viral reservoirs, and continues to be a place in which we need to investigate when we think about how to take a step back and ask ourselves whether we need to look at viruses as something that are the problem themselves, or whether we need to look at the ways in which we should instead redistribute wealth and dismantle property relations altogether. Thank you.
Yes, I live for a big claim at the end of a presentation. Thank you, Jaffe. Also, just, much like Gauri's work, I'm just floored by the ease with which you move across national boundaries and borders, and make it feel urgent and necessary to do this kind of comparative thinking. I'll, just to give Jaffe a second to breathe before I invite everybody back on screen, I'll do a little pulling together some themes that might have emerged that could help you put together questions, comments, things you want folks to say more about. Also, you can put a question or comment in the Q&A function, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you so that you can ask a question. Sometimes it's easier to formulate the question out loud rather than typing it. But just some themes that emerged that I think are worth thinking through together from these really stunning, gorgeous, beautiful, smart, also gut-wrenching presentations. One is bureaucracy. Whether we're thinking about the American Bureau of Medical Aid banking blood, or in Jaffe's work, or the role of experts in deciding what medical futures and AIDS futures look like, to Dr. Benton thinking about bureaucratic survivors, and even Shaka's work naming the process of reimbursement at the university, and having to bring one's sexuality into interface with the university through that kind of bureaucracy. Visuality also came up a lot, from the education posters in Dr. Vijay Kumar's presentation, to Dr. Cheng's description of the glass sculptures that try to visualize COVID-19 or try to make us see or think differently the virus, to Dr. McLaughlin talking about the sort of hiding of labor that the short 15-second TikTok might do. And also Dr. Benton talking through the picture in which you pose at the end of the discharge. We also get to think about the role of the academic and in producing knowledge, as Dr. McLaughlin is called forth to be on a podcast and offer expertise and think with the moment, and saying, when can I say no? Or asking us to think about what does it mean to go viral as an academic, to be cited. Dr. Vijay Kumar also, has this moment in which studies at Harvard and Yale are an incitement towards different kinds of engagements with sex workers and can be responded to, which was really, really fantastic. And of course, I mentioned earlier that Adia has published about the anthropologist's relevance in moments of medical emergency. We also hear a lot about labor, whether it's the making of surplus bodies through slavery and incarceration in Jife's work, to a person who has to go on a bike picking up semen and asking people to ejaculate, to the effects that on the lives of sex workers during the COVID pandemic. So just some really incredible confluences between your works that I really appreciate you thinking with each other already. And I hope you'll turn on your screens and we can see your wonderful faces and we can talk with each other. And I want to take and here's a little round of applause for you because you're just fantastic. Thank you. I want to start by taking a sort of prompt from Shaka's work and presentation to ask, how have you been called upon in this last year, given your work, given your expertise, other than an invitation like this for a panel on going viral, right? Which Faith, Laura, and I conceived to respond to the moment. And when I look back at the description of what I wrote, even that description feels very old for what this panel was supposed to be and think about, 7 months ago. So I'd love to hear about how you've been asked to labor in this pandemic, and to bring expertise or thoughts or feelings into the public sphere as academics working on viruses and virality.
I think that there's part of it is that there's like profound imposter syndrome that I have even all these years later. So there are many ways in which I'm not, for me in particular, I'm not really I don't really feel like I'm an expert. I'm a generalist who sort of follows certain kinds of interests more than a normal person. I actually was trying to count earlier today, like the things I did just this semester, because it's like getting tapped by the institution to do the diversity stuff, getting tapped by students to fight the institution who's not doing enough diversity stuff, doing the panels and it's a lot, and I think that, when we think about kind of the virality of capitalism, if we use that framing, right, where if capitalism, is the virus that exhausts the host, even if we need it on a day-to-day, but it exhausts the host, like that's sort of where where I'm at with that, and I think tonight, I was trained as a visual artist. I'm trying to go back and experiment with different forms, and with everything going on, I was like, okay, am I going to put something together and really do totally new thinking about feminism and virality? And I did work around HIV/AIDS in the past, like when I was doing my dissertation field work and a little bit in my book, but the viral hasn't really been central, but there are all these adjacent things that have. And so I just sort of wanted to render something in a more like a series of affective registers, to just sort of, rather than maybe let that function as a kind of proto-theorization of this, So virality in these contexts was really like the kind of constant circulation amongst these digital networks in terms of desire and sex and sexual labor. Virality was the rabbit hole, right, of getting hooked by something that was soothing in different kinds of ways. And yeah, and then I think Kareem, you were really smart too in the sense of you know, the ways that, you know, 30-second TikToks looks really easy to make. It's not easy. It's like not easy. If you guys have tips and tricks, like let me know. And in that way, it's not unlike academic labor. Like even here, you know, performing these forms of academic labor, some of that labor is invisible, right?
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I could say something. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've struggled with this past year in terms of talking expertise about the pandemic is that I have found, and I managed to write about this a little bit kind of a year in, but I actually found that expertise sort of failed me in thinking about, I actually had COVID twice, which I think I'm like one of the few people who has had it twice. And both times I got it, it was at times when I was supposed to be producing a lot of academic work. So I was at copy edit stages of my book. The first time I was doing the final draft of my book. So my memory is of being in quarantine and just trying to write this book about AIDS. And it was this very jarring disconnect. And it really, for me, emphasized in a way that actually sort of being pregnant also did for me, the fact that thinking bodies are bodies, and that when your body comes up against limits, you also struggle to theorize, right? And so, and I think when I look at the kind of field of expertise that's been produced about COVID, I see that at play. Like we can see who's more present and visible, and who's unable to be, or who's unable to be in the kind of polished ways we expect in academic circuits. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you. We have some fantastic questions in the chat that I'm going to read out, and they are open to all of you. Not everybody has to answer every time if you don't have an answer to offer. And again, you can use the hand raise function and for the audience to let me know that you'd like me to unmute you so that you can ask a question. But a question comes from Dr. Anjali Arundekar. Jai Bhim. Have viral temporalities disrupted viral geographies? That is, has the current pandemic and its geographic and variant ubiquity corrupted the before and after telos of development discourse that so animates public health ethos? What happens when we can no longer summon the power of curative capital? Anjali also adds, thanks for a wonderful conversation, learning, and listening.
I love that question. I read it when it was coming up, and it was difficult at first for me to kind of think through it. I mean, I would say, we can say yes, and I think then the interesting bit will be in the details. And I think the other panelists, given the diverse field sites that people are working with, might have some. My work is mostly based in the US and a little bit in Europe, but you know, there were different temporalities during COVID, right? There was the slow, is it Tuesday or is it Thursday? You know, and then every day was either a Tuesday or a Thursday, it seemed, right? There was the sense that a whole year passed and it took forever, but now it's still like, is it March, is it April of 2020 or 2021? So there's some kind of like quantum temporality, I think, that is a viral temporality, that different places will be different, right? Like Gary, I didn't have COVID, but I did. My body is basically like, you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be sitting in front of a computer. You shouldn't be sitting, period. And you know, and so it's at the time now, labor becomes in these 25-minute increments of like, work, stand up, move around, work, stand up and move around. But I've been able, as a tenured professor, as someone, I live on the campus where I teach, which is like a bubble in Westchester. It's like being on a spaceship over the summer, totally empty. That geography is very different than someone who had to go work, you know? Yeah. I mean, I think the second part of the question maybe is more relevant for others, but in terms of the development discourse, yeah. I have lots of apps though for curative capital. If you want app suggestions, I don't know if any of them work, but $3.99 in-app purchases. Oops.
You should drop them in the chat. This has been a very lively chat, and people are learning new things about at least emojis today, but apps are welcome. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I saw this question and I've been puzzling over it for a while now. So I don't really have a perfect, or probably would never have a perfect answer, but I think, I mean, at least in the context of what I presented just now, I do think there were several points in the formation of AIDS discourses in India where that corrupted a development telos, as you put it, Anjali. So in the and especially, and I'm not a historian, so you know, someone can correct my periodization, but in the early medical journal articles I looked at, there was this real kind of uncertainty about whether India was modern or not. And this question about, you know, and it was almost like a solidaristic discourse around kind of the third world in opposition to this Western capitalist virus. And that shifted later when the discourse became about an African virus that was going to threaten Indian morality. And then by the time I was doing field work, there was this kind of positioning around India's technocratic advancement in successfully managing AIDS. So there were, at multiple points, there were these kind of I think, openings to sort of challenge discourses of development and sort of public health modernity. And I see that too now, because I think and I've been reading all the kind of media articles about why Africa doesn't have a major COVID pandemic and why journalists are so flummoxed by this, and it's so hard to for them to acknowledge kind of any sort of state expertise or a management capacity. So it's always, you know, weird biological reductionist explanations. But I do think there's this kind of because of the temporality of the pandemic being sort of disrupted, there is space to negotiate positions in the global order. But I'd be really curious to hear what other people think about this question.
I think I'll take Adia, did you want to say anything? I don't want to jump in before you. Okay. I'll try to answer this because I think I'm understanding what Anjali's asking. I think two things are happening right now, which is also two things that were happening during HIV/AIDS in its earlier years. That is, you have people who are engaged in structural change, activists on the ground. So not only ACT UP or queer activists during the early AIDS crisis years or into the 90s, but also longstanding Black, Indigenous, and brown activists that were already engaging in challenging the state, the US state in particular. And today we have Black Lives Matter and a variety of movements that have been inspired by Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Lives Matter. And fundamentally they're calling not just for a corrective to COVID, but structural changes that actually would dismantle policing and property. But I also think at the same time, vaccines are a prime example of how private companies can find ways to make money out of this. And they're right before the start of COVID-19 pandemic, there was the controversy involving the US educated and trained biophysicist He Jiankui, who used CRISPR to genetically edit a set of twin embryos that were given birth to as a twin set of girls that were supposedly genetically resistant to HIV. And there is going to be discussion now that we have a crisis called COVID, whether we should move to using CRISPR to protect against COVID. And I think that viruses are basically not the problem, but actually a response to the human belief that we can actually dominate the globe and continue to dismantle ecosystems. So until this world is destroyed, or until we make these foundational changes, at least these two different avenues to dismantle property, I don't think capitalism is going to end. I think it'll find ways to adapt.
Work. Like, give me palpitations. I'm gonna this came up briefly in Gauri's comments, but I'm gonna ask a question from Leanne, who says, "Thank you for these insightful talks and for the coming conversation. Could panelists please speak to what metaphors of or claims to virality, example racism as a virus, may take for granted and what they might obscure?"
I wonder if this partly was the fact that I posted that in the chat, which is racism a virus? I don't think so. Why does it need to be? It could just, but I think part of it is, it may be that racism is the cell. Oh, you probably are yelling now. My son has excellent timing. He's been quiet the entire time. Anyway, it might be the cells, the structure that is being used for virus or for whatever to propagate. I'm so proud of you for dropping out of medical school, actually. Obviously, this was a better way to go. So anyway, that was the and actually the way that the reason I even said that was because I had been dealing with this, the constant reminder that the CDC recently has decided that racism is a public health threat. And some people call it a public health crisis. And, and I'm like, actually public health is a racist crisis or a racist threat. Because of some of the mechanisms or practices and logics that undergird its practice, particularly in the US, and particularly in models that I think derive from US-based training. And so one of the things that I'm writing about in this current book is it's merely a side story, but it's a very interesting one to think about the imagery that builds up around the disease detectives and the epidemic intelligence services. Epidemic intelligence service at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. There's this thing called the Field Epidemiology Training Program, where it's sort of like EIS light. So EIS officers in the US, they're usually, they're doctorates. They have doctorates. They want to spend 2 years doing outbreak investigations and other public health functions. Whereas in field epidemiology training programs, they might target doctors in third world countries or low and middle income countries, however you choose to make that. But they also expand these courses are shorter and address a different cadre of health people, often doing work that's called surveillance. And I sound like one of those people who's like, bad things, there's a conspiracy, but actually no, the reason that US public health is very surveillance focused is because the person who came up with the idea had been in the military and had been thinking about chemical weapons and bioweapons as we entered the Cold War. And so this epidemic intelligence was actually, like, it is what it is. And when people say that EIS officers are disease detectives, it's a way of softening the intelligence and the kinds and the idea of intelligence and data gathering and all of this other stuff. Now, that said, one of the conclusions that I think I'm coming to as I'm doing this work is like, I kind of am starting to try to figure out, is epidemiology policing? Is that a metaphor or an analogy? Is crime disease? What kinds of exorbitant analogisms, to cite Mark Seltzer and others who've used this, what work does that do, and what does it reveal when it's used socially and politically? And so that I was getting to the point of, like, how far do we take this, and what does it ultimately mean to imagine epidemiology as functioning, or contact tracing as one of those strategies, in ways that actually reflect local interpretations of those state practices, and their experiences with them, and the degree to which they mimic or are analogous to or are these acts of invasion, surveillance, and intelligence, and violence. Does that answer the question? Yes, I think the point was that if we want to think about the metaphors and we want to think about the analogies, we have to think about them to their logical conclusions. But I think we also have to think about genealogies.
I'd love to just riff on that. Thank you so much, Adia. That makes a lot of sense. I think one of the takeaways I'm hearing from you is that, can we think about viruses outside of state logics? And the reason I bring that up is I'm thinking about Ed Cohen's essay called Viral Paradox. It's a longer name, and I'll try to find it and put it in the chat. But that essay really has us challenge us to rethink our understanding of viruses necessarily embedded in the host parasite relationship. So he starts to trace back the way that the host parasite relationship comes from a genealogy of Roman and Greek law, and how it structures our understandings of both the body as well as the state. And so we always imagine that something comes from the outside and settles into the body uninvited, whereas there's a guest that's invited by the host, but there's also a parasite, which is the enemy, and we have the right to defend against this enemy. But that's the way that we're enforcing our views of viruses, when a host-guest parasite relation is inherently foundational to just state ideology. There doesn't have to be a host-guest parasite relationship if we think outside of state logics. Viruses don't have to be coming from a foreign place or from some reservoir. And we don't have to think about bodies with infections as somehow the problem or coming from the outside either.
Before I move on to another question, I just want to check if there are any other thoughts or comments.
Yeah, I was just, I was thinking about the capitalism as a virus and racism a virus, and what Adia said about how racism is the body. And I think, so one of the limits of the racism as a virus is that it externalizes racism and makes it something that comes into your body instead of something that is your body. So maybe it's actually, I mean, I think for me, the passage I put on my slide about this was actually about neoliberal governance modalities, which I think actually work pretty well for the metaphor, because they can repurpose racist structures in the service of neoliberalism. And so, but I think the metaphor works for neoliberalism, neoliberal governance techniques better than it works for racism, or even patriarchy or heteropatriarchy.
Thank you for that. So we have a question from Hillary asking, all of you are engaging with various forms of bureaucracy and an ordering of things. I'd love to hear what you think are alternatives.
Can you reread the question? Because I rejoined through my
Yeah.
phone. I can't see it anymore.
Sure. All of you are engaging with various forms of bureaucracy and an ordering of things. I'd love to hear what you think are alternatives. And Jaffe, if I can put you on the spot, because I feel like this is actually something you cataloged for us, right? That and you concluded towards a gesture towards alternatives. So maybe we can start with where what you're thinking with.
I'll be short. Thank you. I'm not anti-vax at all. That's not what I'm arguing. I think we should have biomedical interventions, but they always have to be done in relation to foundational and structural changes. And I don't just mean tweaking the state or tweaking biomedicine. I mean, literally, we should get rid of institutional marriage. We should get rid of property relations. We should have global access to healthcare and resources. And I think that does mean we have to imagine something beyond the nation state form. But the beginning, it has to be a redistribution of, like, dismantling of police and prisons and redistributing healthcare as just a starting point so we can open up to that imagination.
I mean, one thing it would just be like, well, what about the disordering of things? You know, start with the institutions where we're at. I think a lot about, you know, the kind of work that's going on right now in Black study, where, you know, for a number of years now, thinking through the work of someone like Fred Moten, right, of having, there are already existing spaces, they already exist that are alternatives to that. So the question then is, how do we find them? How do we orient ourselves to them? How do we cultivate them? How do we resist, you know, I guess most of us are academics, like we're in these highly regimented, highly bureaucratized in industry. We're in an industry. You know, Spivak called it's the teaching machine. So if we're going to think about those changes, like how would we start to make them in our backyard? Whether that's like get onto the committee at your institution about who oversees tenure and how start to tweak how those decisions are made. I absolutely agree too. You know, of course we need these, you know, huge structural changes, but I'm just trying to get out of bed and like into the office or something, you know, without falling apart. One thing I was thinking about during the last, and by thinking about, I mean looking up on Wikipedia, was I know that there are viruses that we just already have, like we have a virome, right? And that's sort of one of the very interesting logics about, or the ways in which the sort of the symbolism of the virus is one in which, you know, this outside agent that's infecting us that comes from somewhere else, right? When we're in this kind of relation already with viruses. And I think that in that sense, maybe the metaphor about racism as a virus makes sense. Like we all already have racism in us, right? And it just depends like how much your antibodies are fighting them. For me, that the viral kind of like thinking about viruses as like as a social in terms of sociality, I do think about it. I get the racism one. Like I wouldn't normally think about racism as a virus in the same way, but I do think about fascism as a virus somehow, like as a thought. Like I think I don't know however many people have read William Burroughs, right? But Burroughs was really into the idea of a virus. He called language as a virus, right? Language is the first meme, like literally. And so I'm very interested in the way that these kinds of affects or these moods can sweep through. And, you know, soccer mom is now QAnon, and, you know, Michigan militiaman is now QAnon, you know, that how these things travel and circulate, impact, and then stick and endure. I think those are very I don't know if this gets at that, right? But yeah, I don't know if you can fight like the order of things or bureaucracy with. I don't know if there's an inoculation. You know, I don't know if there's a vaccine for that. There might have to be some other way of getting at that.
I think, Shaka, your comments really dovetail well into the next question. So I'm going to ask it, and folks can sort of respond to the last one or think about this one. But from Dr. Tasha Oren, Tasha asks, many of you reference specific conflicts of expertise and power in which trust or lack of it is so central. Yet in the general cultural vernacular, virality, going viral on social media, is so associated with affect, impulse, and the lack of rationality. Is this simply a fracture of the metaphor, or is there something productive about this disjunction between power and affect?
I know I just said something sort of like about this, but I just want to add one thing and then I'll stop, which is the part about rationality, like a lack of rationality. When you come across in whatever platform, right, like a viral post that is actually tagged viral, that is an indication of like real rationality, right? That there are whole industries that are built up about, which is its own thing, right? Like there are industries that are built around producing virality, like at least in the context of social media, right? Like I could hire someone and have a better video, you know, much better videos than the ones I've made. I could buy likes, I could really like study the algorithm, how it works, everything else. But I think that I don't know if lack of rationality, like if that is the right frame. Like the rest I totally agree with, like affect, impulse, so on. But I think rationality is there actually is a rationality at work, whether it's algorithmic or kind of at the level of the social actor who is, you know, creating these videos.
I mean, there's even a rationality in terms of how people always feign surprise when they go viral. You know, oh, I had no, since you, I had no idea this would be liked so much, here's my SoundCloud, right? That's the predictability, drop your SoundCloud in the link, or there's this I guess there, I would say maybe not predictability, but at least a kind of conditioned, patterned set of responses. So in terms of how people kind of engage, or even the fact that like, I mean, I'm always on Twitter, so this is my touchstone, which is sometimes things are trending because people are wondering why that thing is trending, right? Oh my goodness, Betty White, is Betty White dead? You know, and then everyone kind of goes, oh no, I checked to see why Betty White is trending, which then adds it to the, you know, continues to kind of place it in that space of virality, right? Like it feeds itself. You know, I think one of the things that, you know, if you're talking about the virome, I want to kind of, I guess I keep thinking about the virome, and I was for some reason at this Bellagio event many years ago about the idea of immunity. So the self-host relation is only one way of thinking about the viral. And, you know, it's not simply because of what we host in our own bodies, but really like how that metaphor, and I think because it actually originates as this political concept about who kind of resides within a polity or whatever, or what that what that means, and how people affiliate towards it or with it. It having that, and of course, like I said, this is actually old immunology. Like this is stuff that people have been talking about for decades. So how do you, what would it mean to actually bring those ideas in line with existing ideas about the immune system? Actually, maybe that's what I was getting at, is like, we're talking about virality, but there's also this other piece that kind of keeps coming up, which is a system that responds to difference or non-self, that recognizes, remembers, right? We're all like, oh, get a shot, remember, so that it can remember. We saw that TikTok where the splice proteins. I actually was watching that with great interest because I was like, those visualizations those animations and visualizations are really quite stunning. Has nothing to do with answering the question, but anyway, I'm just riffing and blah, 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 because I love viral things. I don't love the ones that kill people. But it's one of the, but it's something that I've obviously invested in a bunch of different ways. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think I am thinking about how, and this was really clear in Shaka in your presentation, that virality and what Adia just said, that virality is the product of labor, and the association with affect or impulse or lack of rationality is kind of, it's actually an association that obscures the labor that's at the heart of, and the power also, right? Because going viral also requires, maybe I'm just saying this because I have like 200 Twitter followers, but there is power associated with going viral and being able to do and doing the labor of going viral that actually I think, and all of our circulating discourses about COVID too, kind of, and the metaphors we use to describe it, obscure the power relations and the labor and thought and intentionality and rationality.
Can I ask though, is it also just sort of eliding the labor of the virus or the cell doing the machinery that's being sort of hijacked? Because the way that we're talking about it, sort of like this effortless move through things, but harnessing the machinery of the cell to reproduce more of itself. The way that we learn about proteins and their production is that, listen to me, it's been a long time since and I was a bio major and I I studied, whatever. But that, I was like, wait, there is actually energy, energy produced in cells at this point. So I kind of wonder how it is that we've been able to kind of elide, obscure, obfuscate all of these forms of labor through the analogy or the metaphor of the virus. Because actually when you actually listen to how people, they also talk about viruses as invisible, and they being like journalists in, say, Sierra Leone, invisible enemy. Which, I always used to fight that. I was like, well, actually what you end up doing with an invisible enemy is you magnify it. You magnify it by putting up checkpoints where the military used to also sit during war. You do it by using those checkpoints to take people's temperature. You let some people pass because they couldn't possibly be carrying Ebola. Those people were white people in Jeeps, okay? So, so this, what does that sort of gloss over the labor, how does that sort of accrue to virality? Because yes, it never occurred to me that making a TikTok was easy. I mean, people used to do those 6-second vines, and I was like, who are these genius magicians who can they basically, I think they're storyboarding these. They're going, this is the story I want to tell. What are the 10 images? Or if I had to give you a tip, I would say they're probably
you have to storyboard it. That's right.
Yeah,
you do.
And
you have to storyboard it.
You have to kind of, because I think about the editing process. I'm kind of I would have to basically imagine this as a comic book. Anyway, again, off topic, but I am thinking about, no, actually, maybe it's not. It's the labor. And all of the reverse engineering to understand the labor, because no one is actually showing it to you. I mean, maybe there is somebody on YouTube actually who's like, this is how you make a really good viral TikTok.
No, there are so many people on YouTube. I've watched a lot of those videos. If I can be so bold as to share one more TikTok, because I think it gets at the question of labor. It gets the story. You'll see the storyboarding. but it gets at metaphors of warfare as well. That I think, and yeah, it's fun. It's fun.
You need to make this. What is it? It's a part of a virus. A virus? Just a part of it, not the actual virus. They're called COVID-19. They have fork hands and they're coming. Fork hands? Please. What is this? This messenger told me to make them. I've never seen these before. I'll make some new antibodies to get rid of them. Seize the forks. Nice body. Gonna make this place my new home. Fork hands. Seize them.
You're welcome.
I love that one. I've seen that one
That's
before.
hilarious.
It's so good. I'm like, it's science.
It was a full-fledged drama. I was. How many costume changes were there?
That took a lot of labor.
He had to put on at least 4 t-shirts. He took 4 different shirts. So
yeah. Unless you want to riff on that, we've come to the end of our questions. You have all been. Let me before I shower you with praise. Are there any final comments and thoughts that anybody wants to share?
I don't want to open up a whole can of worms, but like I keep thinking and coming back to, you know, folks talking about immunity and like there's this weird image of the body as kind of de facto immune, and then anything else is like a problem, like that interrupts this, you know, state of whatever, like purity. And I think one of the things that's been so interesting about hearing about people's work is again, these themes of labor, the transnational circulation of material and semiotic material, like literal fluids, but also ideas. And this idea of like the body being host already to things that are it and not it at the same time. I don't know, I was really struck by that, by some of those earlier comments about immunity. And just, for me, there's something very rich in that, you know, in that, especially when we think about like capitalism or something like that. Like what would developing an immune response to capitalism look like? Or is it that just like depression? You know, that's just depression. So anyway, I learned a lot tonight. I'm very glad to have been able to listen to everyone's work.
Yeah, I can riff on that because I've been thinking about the idea of immunity as kind of so it's something that makes you more invulnerable and better, right? But it also comes at a cost because you've lost something, right? So I've been thinking about this because I'm thinking about what it's going to be like for all of us to, for example, go back to teaching in person, and what of our ability to do that has been lost, right? Or what of our ability to be in physical space with others have been lost. And I don't think we're really going to be able to come to terms with that for a long time. But, you know, for me, it's manifested in really specific ways as symptoms of COVID that I still deal with. But they come also with this kind of new sense of immunity, right? So it's like the virus takes from you and also like equips you with a new impermeability. And I think that is something that we'll all have to figure out in our own ways in the next kind of the years to come.
I just left a few folks' books that were written about histories of immunity in relation to politics and economics. Ed Cohen and also Emily Martin.
Well, thank you all for really brilliant, exceptional work from Dr. Benton, your vividly described ethnographic notes that move so easily into thinking about state projects and connecting the macro and micro so clearly to Jifei, your really exceptionally mapped sort of biopolitical transnational geography of blood banking and the sort of carcerality, the carceral logics behind thinking with HIV and AIDS and the sort of the whose bodies are left behind as we try to make and imagine futures, I think is incredible. Shaka, the way that you made for us, and you worked within media to and your voice sort of overlapping time and multiplying on each other was really just a gorgeous way to open us up. And Gauri, just your framing a triangulation of the U.S. and Africa and India in comparative and intimate modes was really valuable, but also just your final moment of sex workers speaking back to academics, I think left a really deep impression on me at least, and friends who have been texting me as well during the talk. So just thank you for your kind, thoughtful, generous engagements. I know it's a lot to ask, to think new thing, to think of new things in the midst of the semester, in the midst of this like extractive mode that we're all working in right now. So grateful to you. Please, friends who are listening, please light up the chat with compliments and thank yous, and let these folks know how much we appreciate them. And Stacy and Badria, and thank you. Our captioner today is Rochelle Hopkins, who has, thank you to you as well. And yeah, I hope you, Stacy, don't turn it off yet until people have finished typing their comments, but thank you all for being here. Faith, Elora, and I are really excited to organize Feminisms Unbound next year, and we promise it will be lively and beautiful, just as today has been. So thank you all, and have a wonderful, wonderful night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Really lovely. I have to get Gauri's book now.
Yeah. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.